As we look at Gilded Age politics, a good place to start is to think about our modern political parties, which coincidentally are the same political parties that had power in the Gilded Age. Throughout American history, we've seen different political parties rise and fall, but ultimately we had the Democratic Party develop out of the old Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party, and eventually we had a political party in the 1840s rise to prominence that was mainly opposed to slavery, known as the Republican Party. Now, by the time of the Civil War, other parties, such as the Federalists, such as the Whigs and the American Party, the Know Nothing Party, parties like this had come and gone. These two parties became the mainstay of our two-party system. But at the time of the Civil War, Lincoln was a Republican. And Lincoln and the Republicans won control in Washington, opposed the Confederacy, and ultimately won the war. So coming out of the Civil War, the Republicans are the party in power, but they're also a party with a problem. Their main goal was to stop slavery, and it's gone. The one plank in their platform has been achieved, but they have all the power. So what do they do with the power? They're not just going to walk away and say, well, we're done. So they have to reform and come up with what their party stands for. Now, the Democrats also were in trouble. They had been shattered as a party. The South had been solidly Democrat, and they were the rebels. They were the traitors. And they had, during Reconstruction, had no power. So as Reconstruction ends and as white Southerners regain the right to vote, they become Democrats. But they don't have the power, not by themselves. Now, there's also others who are Democrats in the North. And they've been ruined by being branded a party of traitors as well. Many of the Democrats had opposed the war or wanted to make peace and accept less than victory. And the Democratic Party is going to have to reform itself. And so both parties, just like they are today, they're really coalitions to get enough people together so that you can win an election. Well, the modern Democrats and Republicans, as we look at the way they were more than 100 years ago, you're going to see some things haven't changed. Some things have totally flipped. And some things, well, they weren't even issues back then, or they were issues back then and they're not issues now. So let's look at how these parties started to take their modern shape after the Civil War. Now, first of all, there's several factors. The spoils system is going to be an issue for both parties. Back during the age of Jackson, we had begun to make this a thing where when you win office, you clean house. So if you got elected president and you were a Democrat, you fire all the Republicans that were in office and you give the jobs, not necessarily to the best man, but to the people who supported you and helped you get that position as president. And so it becomes a reward system, and this is a problem, and there's a lot of corruption with this, and it definitely didn't get the best men in the job all the time. But this was the way politics were done at that time. Now, another thing that's going to come around at this time is the concept of waving the bloody shirt. That's your military record. If you wore blue during the Civil War and fought for the Union, then that's going to help you get elected up north. Down south, though, well, that bloody shirt better be gray because they ain't voting for no Yankee. But you're not going to win an election if you were a Confederate, not nationally, but down south, if you want to be the governor of Texas or a congressman from Georgia, once Reconstruction's over, you better have been a Confederate. So your war record is going to influence your political opportunities. Now, the South itself is going to become the solid South. After the Civil War, they're bitter about Reconstruction, they're bitter about the Civil War, and they're not voting for a Republican. However, it doesn't mean they're going to have necessarily the same ideology as, say, a Northern Democrat. And the Democratic Party really becomes kind of an oddity in the fact that down south, Democrats were really, even back then, conservative. Democrats up north, even back then, tended to be more on what you'd call a liberal side. And so that party kind of is connecting two very unnatural groups together to oppose the Republicans. Now, ultimately, as we'll see later at the end of the course, that solid South flips. It's still a solid South, but now it tends to be solidly behind the Republicans in our modern era. But again, it's still that conservative vein in the South that really makes it solid one way or another. Now, the Republican Party, one thing, and I don't have it on the slide, but it's very important, the Republican Party today and back then is often considered the party of big business. And that was a natural fit. To win the Civil War, Lincoln needed the businesses to help produce the goods for war. And so there's a cooperation between Republicans and big business, and during the war, they marry. And after the war, when the Republicans are trying to figure out what they stand for, well, a lot of the people who have power and influence in their party are businessmen. And the Republican Party very quickly takes up the interests of big business. And of course, along with this, there's going to be corruption, and there's going to be dirty dealings going on. And this is one thing we're going to see later when we talk about the progressive era, is within our politics. There was a lot of corruption that needed to be fixed, and we'll see some of this addressed. But the Republican Party becomes the party of big business. But that's not enough. You're not going to win an election if the only people voting for you are the rich businessmen, because that's not the majority of people in the country. So the Republicans need to win over other voters. And they very quickly decide, hey, we've got to win over the middle class, because we're not going to get the poor workers in the factories that we're paying very little money to. We've got to win over that middle class, get them to think they're part of us. But what can we offer them? Well, one of the things the Republican Party very quickly comes upon the idea of is moral reform. Now, today, moral reform looks a little different than it did back then, but the idea is if you can tap into some moral or even Christian values that you can win over the middle class with, then you can get them to vote for your other interests. Back then, one of the forms the Republicans used to win over middle-class voters were what we called, in Texas, up through my childhood, blue laws. Laws to respect the Sabbath. So the idea was, we're going to set aside Sunday as a holy day, and we're going to do that by passing laws to force businesses to close. So when I was a kid, I would leave church on Sunday, and we'd drive down to the Safeway to buy us a bucket of chicken, and as we walked through the Safeway, we'd walk past the beer aisle. There was a net over it. Couldn't buy beer. Walk past the cosmetics aisle. Couldn't buy cosmetics and hairspray. You'd buy your chicken, you'd drive home, you'd pass the mall, and the mall was shut down because you couldn't go buy and sell at the mall, because the only things allowed open on Sunday were necessities like gasoline and food. That was it, because we were respecting the Sabbath by law, by legislation. And laws like this that the Republicans start to pass are meant to win over moral voters that are worried about issues like this. And they found other issues as well. So they start to try to win over that group. Now, the Democrats, they're going to target some people. We've already mentioned the solid South. They're going to have the Southerners. The Democrats also start to appeal to, I don't have it right here on the slide, but rural voters, not just Southerners, but folks out west, people who aren't in the big cities and aren't tied to big business. Try to win over rural voters by paying attention to them. But then there's another group. A lot of folks up there in those cities are working class. They're immigrants. And they start reaching out to them, trying to offer them, trying to offer passing laws that are going to improve pay or improve conditions in the factories. And so they're putting together a coalition of people with very different interests and putting them together to oppose their opponents. So both parties are trying to find the combination to win elections. So, as you studied at the end of 1301, in 1877, Reconstruction came to a close as white Southerners were gaining the vote. Democrats were starting to have a chance to actually compete in a presidential election. And up here you have, on one side, you've got Rutherford B. Hayes. On the other side, you've got Tilden, the Democratic candidate. It was a very close election. So close that they had to do recounts in a couple of states. And the Congress was going to have to decide which candidate had won the states, which would decide who won the election. And so the Democrats and Republicans on this committee basically cut a deal. And they said, look, we Republicans promise, if you Democrats will just let us have this election, let us win these states, that the first thing we'll have Hayes do is Hayes will pull the troops out of the South and end Reconstruction. And so they cut that deal. And Reconstruction came to a close, Hayes became president, and we move into the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction era. Now, let's look at some of the before we get into politicians, we need to first of all look at the Republican Party itself. It's the party that has most of the power, and it also is split. It's divided. On one end, you've got the bigwigs, the stalwarts, the businessmen and the politicians that have been around for a while, and they have the power, they have the influence, they're extremely conservative in their business interests, and they don't want to compromise. They want to protect what they have. On the other side, you've got the mugwumps. Now, they're Republicans who are today what we'd call moderates. They're willing to work across the aisle with Democrats on certain issues. They see corruption that needs to be cleaned up. They see issues in society that need to be addressed, even problems with big business that might need to be regulated. That doesn't make the stalwarts happy. Caught in between the stalwarts and these mugwumps, these fence-sitters, are the half-breeds. They're not as corrupt and set in their ways as the stalwarts, but they're also not as idealistic as the mugwumps. So they basically, every time the Republicans are picking a candidate, there's this power struggle between the mugwumps and the stalwarts. The stalwarts will usually get their way, or at least mostly get their way. The half-breeds are kind of in the middle, and as the half-breeds go, so goes the party. Now, these are some of the elections that take place. The election of 1880 is won by another Republican, James Garfield. But shortly after he became president, he was killed. This little character up at the top, a fellow by the name of Charles Guiteau, he was a nut. And he gave a speech and made a little pamphlet that he passed out to a few people saying, vote for Garfield. And he thought that Garfield knew all about him and that he had personally got Garfield elected. Quite frankly, Garfield never heard of this guy. But this guy kept going out to his mailbox expecting to have a big government position, spoil system, to reward him for his work. And when he didn't get it, well, he got mad, went down to the railroad station because presidents just traveled like everybody else and stood in line at the railroad, walked up, pulled out a gun, shot the president. It was that easy. Well, once people found out why this nut job shot the president, and it was because of the spoil system, people started realizing there was corruption and a problem and needed to be fixed. And what's surprising is the guy who comes into office as the vice president was a stalwart. Garfield had been a little bit more moderate, and he had been kind of the compromise candidate, but the stalwarts wanted their guy as vice president. And a lot of people felt like when Chester Arthur became president, that he would be very stuck in his ways and very unwilling to change anything, but he ends up being a little bit more of a half-breed as a Republican in the way he runs things. He's a bit more moderate, and during his administration, he'll address this problem that the public is calling out about, and we'll see the Pendleton Civil Service Act put limitations on the spoil system. Now, if you want a government job instead of working for some candidate, you got to pass the civil service test. You got to earn the position. And that's going to help clean up politics. Now, in the next election, both the Republicans and the Democrats picked great candidates. Both of them were very wise in their choices. The Republicans picked a guy by the name of Blaine. Now, he's very acceptable to the stalwarts, but he's Irish. He appeals to the immigrants, who the Republicans can't normally get the vote of. But this guy is an Irishman, and he can win over that immigrant vote. But the Democrats were equally as sharp. They picked a guy by the name of Grover Cleveland as their candidate. Now, this guy, two things about him made him a good pick. First of all, he was what we called a bourbon Democrat. He's a Democrat, but he's very pro-big business. So that might win over some businessmen. Also, he was known to be a very good and moral man, which is going to possibly win over the moral voters. And he's famous for this saying, a public office is a public trust. So he's going to try to win over Republicans. Blaine's going to try to win over Democrats. Both of them will stumble miserably. This little political cartoon here, well, that was the first shots fired. This good moral man, Cleveland, depicted in this picture. There's a woman, not his wife, with a baby crying, and it's causing him problems. See, turned out they found this very good moral man was secretly paying child support to this woman because it might have been his baby. See, when you dug deeper, it got even worse. He wasn't even sure it was his baby. The actual issue was this woman had been having an affair with him, and also an affair with one of his friends, and also an affair with one of his other friends. All three of them were seeing the same woman outside of wedlock, which back then was not acceptable. The other two men had wives. At least Cleveland didn't have a wife. And so that's why he was the one paying the child support. When this woman came up pregnant, they didn't know whose baby it was. The other two guys whose wives might have noticed the money was missing, they talked him into being the one to pay her child support. But this, of course, all blew up in his face, and people realized Cleveland's not such a moral man, and he took a big hit in the polls. And things were going along great for Blaine right up until the election. But just a couple of weeks out from the election, he's been campaigning, he's tired. He arrives at a big event in New York where he's going to address a lot of these Irish immigrants. But before he gets up, there's this long-winded politician who gives this introduction for him. And the guy just goes on and on and on, and Blaine's up there kind of, dozing. He's tired. He's not paying attention to what this guy says. The guy introduces him. He gets up. He gives a speech. He leaves thinking he did a great job, and then he reads the newspaper. And what he discovers in the newspapers is that guy that introduced him had insulted the Irish. The guy had called the Democrats the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Well, Romanism, Catholicism, that's the Irish. He's insulting that. Rum, well, the Irish, the stereotype, he's insulting them there. And then he ties all of that to the Democrats as un-American. They're the party of the rebellion. And so all of these insults hurled at the very people that Blaine was trying to win over, and Blaine didn't correct it. He didn't distance himself from that guy, and the newspapers had a field day with it, and suddenly he dropped in the polls. And ultimately, Grover Cleveland, he ends up winning the election. So as president, he ends up, we'll see a couple of things he does in a second, but he's going to be president for 4 years. At the end of that 4 years, the Republicans run a fellow by the name of Harrison, who is going to be in favor of raising the tariff to put a tax on foreign goods to protect American businesses. And at that time, it ended up helping him defeat Cleveland. However, Cleveland ran again 4 years later. And it turned out the tariff was a stupid idea. Because it raised prices on foreign goods, but then the foreign countries raised prices, taxed the American companies, and it ended up failing. It was not a good idea. And so 4 years later, because the tariff had backfired, Cleveland was able to win election. And so he's the only president in our history that was president, lost, and then came back and went to the White House a second time. Now, these are a few of the important things that happened during this time period on the American scene. First of all, this concept, this term, laissez-faire economics, is the idea that government should keep its hands off of business. Let businesses run themselves. Let capitalism, let the business cycle, let the supply and demand regulate businesses. But as we saw, you start ending up with the problem of monopolies being created and competition being quashed by certain businessmen. And so pure capitalism, a lot of businessmen, they want that laissez-faire economics. They don't want government regulations. And if they do, well, it's socialism. But we're going to start to see a need for some regulation or business might get out of hand. And so what we see during Cleveland's administration is the Interstate Commerce Act. This is the first time that the government has stepped in and regulated big business at all. And this is only on businesses that do business from one state to another, but that's the big businesses. So this puts some government regulations and limitations for the very first time on business operation from state to state. But the next business-minded limitation that we see comes out during Harrison's administration. Now, he's the Republican, but by this time they were starting to get an idea that maybe monopolies might not be a good thing. They might be bad for business. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed during Harrison's term of office. Now, although the Republicans passed this act, they really don't use it too much against businesses. In fact, they actually kind of turn it around and label their labor unions as monopolies and try to use this to crush the labor unions. But at least it gets on the books. And a few years later, we're going to see a different Republican president take this law, dust it off, and actually go after some of these monopolies to regulate big business. Finally, the last issue of the times, which was huge in politics, was the free silver movement. Now, it sounds nuts to us today, but once upon a time, our money actually used to be worth something, literally. A dollar bill was a gold certificate, or later a silver certificate. And it said at the bottom, the dollar bills printed in the 1940s, they look like a dollar bill today, except at the bottom it says silver certificate. And it says in the fine print that you can take this dollar to the U.S. government and they have to give you that tiny little bit of silver that dollar is worth, because the money was backed with something called specie. Now, of course, gold and silver are very different forms of specie. Gold is obviously much more valuable. And in the 19th century, our dollars were backed by gold, the gold standard. But some people were pushing the idea of let's back our dollars instead with silver. Now, what that would mean is the dollar would drop in value, but that's exactly what these folks wanted. See, if you weren't one of the rich guys who had a lot of money and therefore want your money to stay valuable, if you were poor, you were in debt. Let's say you're a farmer and you bought a tractor and you owe the bank $100. If money were suddenly to drop in value and it was based on silver, then prices would go up and you could sell your crop for a lot more money. And you would take that more money that you just made and you could go down to the bank where you still owe $100. The number on the ledger doesn't change. And you can more easily pay off your debt. Now, this is obviously, when you think it through, a very short-term fix that only really works once, unless you want to keep devaluing your money. But this movement became a very popular movement. And so the Republican Party was the party that was, for the very wealthy businessmen, promoting the gold standard. The Democrats, and later another party, the Populist Party, is going to promote the idea of the free silver movement. And this candidate up here in this picture, William Jennings Bryan, he gave a very famous speech. You see, he's holding a cross of gold and a crown of thorns using religious imagery. And he gave a speech saying, "Shall we crucify this country on a cross of gold?" In other words, he's saying the silver standard's better. Let's get rid of the gold standard and free people. So that becomes the number one issue that people were fighting about all over the country in presidential politics in the 1890s. And ultimately, this guy, William Jennings Bryan, will run for president, I think, 4 times. He never does win, but he becomes a major candidate pushing for free silver. We're going to see other candidates like William McKinley backing the gold standard. And ultimately, William McKinley is going to be elected president in 1896 and lead us on into the next century. So, that's a little bit about business and politics, this particular slide about politics, in the Gilded Age.